The glass door of Silva's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Academy swung open on a humid Tuesday evening, and Margaret Chen stepped inside. The air smelled like rubber mats and sweat, familiar yet distant, like a song she hadn't heard in decades. She was 67 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a crisp white jai that still had the store creases in it. The advanced class was already warming up. About 20 students were scattered across the mat, doing stretches and light drills. Most of them were young, fit, and covered in tattoos that probably meant something important to them. The energy in the room was intense, competitive. These weren't beginners fumbling through their first armbar. These were serious practitioners who lived and breathed the art. When Margaret walked in, the noise didn't stop immediately. It was more gradual, like a wave rolling backward. First, the guy closest to the door noticed her. He nudged his partner. Then another person looked up. Within seconds, the entire class had gone quiet, all eyes on the elderly woman standing in the doorway with her gym bag over her shoulder. Someone giggled. It was quickly stifled, but it was there. Can I help you?" The voice came from a young man near the back. He had that polite but confused tone people use when they think you're lost. "The beginner's class is tomorrow at 6. Or if you're looking for the yoga studio, that's next door." Margaret didn't respond right away. She just walked further into the room, her bare feet silent on the mat. She could feel every single pair of eyes tracking her movement. Then she heard it, a loud voice, dripping with amusement. "Yo, I think Grandma took a wrong turn." The speaker was a guy in his late 20s, built like he spent more time in the gym than anywhere else. His black belt was worn and frayed at the edges, the kind that came from years of training, not just showing up. His name was Tyler Brooks, though Margaret didn't know that yet. What she did know instantly was his type. She'd met 1,000 Tylers in her life. Cocky, loud, the kind of guy who thought respect was something you took, not earned. A few people laughed. Not everyone, but enough to make the moment sting. Tyler wasn't done. "No disrespect, ma'am, but this is an advanced class, like, we're doing some pretty intense stuff here. I'd hate for you to get hurt." He said it with a grin, like he was doing her a favor, like he was being kind. The instructor, Master Ricardo Silva, finally looked up from his phone. He was in his 40s, stocky and muscular, with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that had apparently taken the evening off. He glanced at Margaret, then at his roster sheet, then back at Margaret. "I'm sorry, do you have an appointment?" His tone was cautious, like he was already preparing to redirect her somewhere else. Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a piece of paper. She walked across the mat, her movement steady and deliberate, and handed it to him. It was her registration form, filled out completely, with the fee paid in full. Ricardo stared at it. His eyebrows went up. "You registered for the advanced class?" "I did." "Ma'am, with all due respect, this class is for people who've been training for years. We're doing live sparring tonight, full contact. It can get pretty rough." Margaret met his eyes. "I understand." There was something in her voice that made Ricardo pause. It wasn't aggressive or defensive. It was just certain. Like she knew exactly what she was doing and wasn't interested in explaining herself. But the damage was done. The whole class had heard the exchange, and the whispers started immediately. "Is she serious? This has got to be some kind of joke. Dude, what if she has a heart attack or something? That's a lawsuit waiting to happen." Tyler, never one to miss an opportunity, raised his hand like he was in elementary school. "Hey, Master Silva, I'll partner with her. You know, keep an eye on things. Make sure Grandma doesn't break a hip." More laughter. Louder this time. Margaret didn't react. She just stood there, her face calm, her hands relaxed at her sides. But inside, something was stirring. A feeling she hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger exactly. More like awakening. Ricardo looked uncomfortable. He was clearly trying to figure out how to handle this without being rude or causing a scene. "Look, Mrs. Chen. Margaret Chen. Mrs. Chen, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but maybe it would be better if you observed tonight. Get a feel for what we do here, and then we can talk about getting you into a more appropriate class." I paid for this class, Margaret said simply. I'd like to participate. There was a long, awkward silence. Ricardo glanced around at his students, probably wondering if any of them would back him up. But most of them were looking down now, suddenly very interested in adjusting their belts or retying their shoelaces. They didn't want to be responsible for what might happen next. Finally, Ricardo sighed. All right, but if at any point you feel uncomfortable or unsafe, you stop. Understood? Understood. Okay, everyone, let's get back to warming up. The class resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a weird tension now, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Margaret found a spot near the edge of the mat and started stretching. She moved through the motions slowly, carefully, her joints protesting after decades of neglect. Tyler, true to his word, positioned himself nearby. He kept glancing over at her, making little comments to his buddies. $10 says she taps out in the first 30 seconds. Dude, you think she'll even last that long? I'm telling you, this is the most entertainment we've had in months. Margaret heard every word. She was supposed to. That was the point. As she stretched, she noticed a few people watching her more carefully. There was a young woman with a purple belt, maybe in her early 20s, who looked genuinely concerned. She kept biting her lip like she wanted to say something but didn't know what. There was also an older guy, probably in his 50s, with a brown belt. He wasn't laughing. He was just watching, his expression thoughtful. But most of the class had already written her off. To them, she was a liability, a distraction. An elderly woman who didn't understand her limitations and was about to learn a hard lesson about pride and reality. Ricardo called everyone to the center of the mat. All right, we're going to do some positional drilling first, then we'll move into live rolls. Start from closed guard. Work your escapes and passes, 5-minute rounds. Partners paired off quickly. Tyler made a big show of walking over to Margaret. Looks like you're stuck with me, Grandma. He grinned, extending his fist for a bump. Margaret bumped it. Her face remained neutral. They took their positions. Tyler sat down, pulling Margaret into his closed guard. His legs wrapped around her waist, and she could feel the strength in them immediately. This wasn't a gentle practice hold. This was a guy who was used to controlling people. Don't worry, Tyler said loud enough for others to hear. I'll go super easy, like baby level easy. Margaret placed her hands on his chest, starting to work on a basic guard pass. Her movements were slow, methodical. Tyler barely had to defend. He just sat there letting her struggle against his frame. That's it, he said in a patronizing sing-song voice. You're doing great. Really great. Someone nearby snickered. Margaret kept working. She tried different angles, different grips. Nothing was getting through. Tyler's defense was effortless because he wasn't really trying. He was just humoring her, the way you'd humor a child playing pretend. After about 3 minutes, Margaret sat back, breathing a little harder than she'd like. Tyler opened his guard and hopped to his feet, extending a hand to help her up. She took it, letting him pull her to standing. See? Not so bad, right? Tyler patted her shoulder. You've got some spunk. I respect that. The timer buzzed. Round over. Ricardo called out the next drill and partners switched. Margaret ended up with the young woman in the purple belt who introduced herself as Amanda. Hey, Amanda said quietly. Are you okay? You don't have to do this if you don't want to. I'm fine, Margaret said. Thank you. Amanda looked like she wanted to say more, but she didn't. Instead, they worked through the drill together, and to Amanda's surprise, Margaret kept up. She wasn't fast, but her technique was cleaner than expected. Her grips were deliberate. Her base was solid. When the drilling portion ended, Ricardo announced what everyone had been waiting for. All right, time for live rolling. Find a partner, and let's go. Remember, control and technique over strength. This isn't a street fight. Tyler's hand shot up immediately. Yo, Master Silva, I got Mrs. Chen. I'll make sure everything stays safe. Margaret watched him approach, watched the confidence in his walk, the smirk on his face. He thought he was being chivalrous. He thought he was doing her a favor. He had no idea what was about to happen. Margaret stood across from Tyler on the mat, and for just a moment the world fell away. The fluorescent lights overhead, the curious stares from the other students, the smell of the gym, all of it faded into the background. What remained was something deeper, something older. Memory is a strange thing. It doesn't live in your mind alone. It lives in your muscles, in your bones, in the way your body responds before your brain has time to think. As Margaret looked at Tyler's cocky grin, her hands began to remember things she thought she'd forgotten. She was 19 years old again, standing in a small gym in Rio de Janeiro. The year was 1977 and the air was thick with humidity and the sound of Portuguese being shouted across the mats. Her father, a diplomat, had been stationed in Brazil for 3 years, and Margaret had fallen completely in love with the country. Not just the beaches or the music, but something deeper. The way people moved. The way they lived in their bodies without apology. She'd discovered jiu-jitsu by accident. A friend had dragged her to watch a class, and Margaret had been transfixed. She'd grown up in Boston, raised in a traditional Chinese-American household where girls were supposed to be quiet and graceful. Her mother had enrolled her in ballet and piano lessons. But jiu-jitsu? That was something else entirely. That was power in its purest form. The instructor's name was Helio Gracie. He was in his 60s then, lean and weathered with eyes that seemed to see through you. He was a legend, though Margaret didn't fully understand that at the time. She just knew that when he moved, physics itself seemed to bend around him. She'd asked if she could join the class. Helio had looked at her for a long moment, this young American girl with her careful posture and nervous smile, and he'd said yes. For the next 2 years, Margaret trained 6 days a week. She was often the only woman on the mat, and the men didn't go easy on her. Helio didn't believe in going easy. He believed in truth. And the truth was that jiu-jitsu didn't care about your size or your gender. It cared about leverage, about timing, about understanding that strength was an illusion that could be manipulated and redirected. Margaret had been a natural, not because she was particularly athletic, but because she was patient. She watched. She listened. She understood that jiu-jitsu was a conversation between bodies. And like any conversation, the key was learning when to speak and when to wait. By the time she earned her brown belt in 1979, Helio had told her she had the potential to be one of the best. Not the best female practitioner, just the best, period. But then life happened. Her father's assignment ended, and the family moved back to the States. Margaret enrolled in nursing school. She met David Chen, a resident at Massachusetts General Hospital, and they fell in love in that intense, all-consuming way that only happens when you're young and everything feels possible. They got married, had 3 kids. She built a career as an emergency room nurse, spending 35 years patching up the broken pieces of other people's lives. The GI stayed in the closet. The mat stayed in the past. She told herself it was okay, that some things were meant for certain seasons of life, and her season on the mat had ended. David knew about her training, of course. He'd seen her old belt, her certificate signed by Helio himself. Sometimes late at night she'd tell him stories about Rio, about the young woman she'd been before life had shaped her into something else. He'd always loved those stories. He'd always told her she should go back to it, but she never did. There was always something more urgent. A kid's soccer game, a double shift at the hospital, a parent getting older and needing care. The years stacked up like plates in a sink, and before she knew it, she was 67 years old and David was gone. He'd died 6 months ago. Heart attack, sudden and cruel. One moment he was laughing at something on TV, and the next he was on the floor and Margaret was doing CPR on her own husband while screaming at 911 to hurry. They'd tried everything at the hospital, but his heart had simply decided it was done. The grief had been overwhelming. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but the quiet, grinding kind that makes you forget what day it is. Margaret had moved through the funeral and the condolence cards and the well-meaning visits from neighbors in a fog. Her kids had been wonderful, checking on her constantly, but eventually they had to return to their own lives, and Margaret was left alone in a house that felt too big and too quiet. That's when she found the GI. She'd been cleaning out a closet trying to keep busy, and there it was, folded carefully, wrapped in plastic, preserved like a museum piece. She'd pulled it out and held it in her hands, and something inside her had cracked open. David's voice echoed in her memory. You should go back to it. You were so alive when you talked about those days. So she'd looked up local jiu-jitsu schools, found Silva's academy online. It had good reviews, serious instructors, a lineage that traced back to the Gracies. She'd registered for the advanced class without thinking too hard about it. Because if she thought too hard, she'd talk herself out of it. And now here she was, standing across from a 20-something black belt who thought he was about to teach her a gentle lesson about knowing her limits. Tyler slapped hands with her to start the roll, and the sound brought her fully back to the present. He gave her a patronizing smile, the kind reserved for children and small dogs. "Ready, Mrs. Chen?" Margaret nodded. Her heart was beating faster now, but not from fear, from something else. Recognition. Tyler approached casually, his guard down, his posture relaxed. He was telegraphing every intention. He wasn't taking this seriously because he didn't think he needed to. In his mind, this was a formality, a box to check before he could move on to a real training partner. He reached for her collar with his right hand, slow and obvious. Margaret watched the hand come toward her, watched the opening it created, and her body remembered. The technique was called Tomoe Nage, a sacrifice throw. You fall backward, pull your opponent over you, and use your legs to launch them through the air. It required precise timing and a willingness to commit completely. Half measures didn't work. You either did it right or you didn't do it at all. Margaret's left hand snapped to Tyler's right sleeve. Her right hand gripped his collar. She dropped to her back, pulling him forward, and planted her right foot in his hip. Time seemed to slow down. Tyler's eyes went wide as he realized what was happening, but by then it was too late. His momentum was already committed. Margaret extended her leg, and suddenly Tyler wasn't on the ground anymore. He was airborne, his body rotating involuntarily, completely out of his control. But Margaret wasn't done. This was the part Helio had drilled into her thousands of times. The throw wasn't the finish. The throw was just the setup. As Tyler flew over her, Margaret maintained her grip on his right arm. She rotated her hips, bringing her legs up and around his extended limb. Her left leg went across his face, her right leg across his hips, and she locked her ankles together. Arm bar. One of the first submissions ever taught in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and still one of the most effective. Margaret controlled Tyler's wrist with both hands, keeping his thumb pointed up. She arched her hips, applying pressure to his elbow joint. Not hard, just enough. Tyler's other hand shot out, slapping the mat frantically, tap, tap, tap. The whole sequence had taken less than 10 seconds. Margaret released immediately, rolling away and standing up in one fluid motion. Her knees protested a little, but the technique had been sound. Muscle memory was a hell of a thing. The gym was silent. Completely, utterly silent. Tyler lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. His face had gone through several colors in rapid succession, finally settling on a deep red that had nothing to do with physical exertion. He wasn't hurt. His ego was bruised, but his body was fine. Margaret had controlled the submission perfectly, applying just enough pressure to force the tap without causing any damage. Someone dropped a water bottle. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet space. Ricardo Silva stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. In his 15 years of running this academy, he'd seen a lot of things. He'd seen tiny women submit massive men. He'd seen beginners get lucky. He'd seen flukes and accidents and surprise victories, but this was something else. The woman he'd tried to redirect to a beginner's class had just executed a perfect competition-level throw-to-submission sequence on one of his best students. And she'd done it with the kind of technical precision that only came from years, maybe decades of serious training. Tyler finally sat up. He looked at Margaret, and for the first time since she'd walked in, there was no smirk. No condescension. Just genuine shock. "What the hell was that?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret extended her hand to help him up. He took it automatically, still dazed, and she pulled him to his feet. "That," she said calmly, "was jiu-jitsu." Ricardo crossed the mat in 4 quick strides. "Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you something."
Have you trained before?
Margaret looked at him. She could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to reconcile what he'd just seen with the elderly woman he'd tried to turn away 15 minutes ago. "Yes," she said simply. "Where? How long?" "Rio de Janeiro. 2 years. A long time ago. Who did you train under?" Margaret reached into her gym bag. Her fingers found what she was looking for, wrapped carefully in a plastic sleeve to protect it from time and damage. She pulled it out and handed it to Ricardo. It was a certificate, old and yellowed at the edges, written in Portuguese. The ink had faded but was still legible. It certified that Margaret Chen had earned the rank of brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. At the bottom, in a distinctive flowing script, was a signature, Helio Gracie. Ricardo's hands trembled as he held the document. He looked at the date, 1979. He looked at the signature, one he'd seen in photographs and videos but never in person. He looked at Margaret. "You trained under Master Helio?" His voice had changed completely. The casual authority was gone, replaced by something close to reverence. "I did." "Why didn't you say anything when you registered?" Margaret shrugged. "It was 46 years ago. I didn't know." So if it mattered anymore. Didn't know if it mattered? Ricardo looked like he might pass out. "Mrs. Chen, do you understand what this means? You have a direct lineage to the founder of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You're part of history." By now the entire class had gathered around. They were all staring at the certificate, at Margaret, trying to process what they were witnessing. The young woman with the purple belt, Amanda, spoke up quietly. "So you're actually, really good?" Margaret smiled for the first time since entering the academy. "I used to be. I'm very rusty now." Tyler, who had been silent, finally found his voice. "Rusty? Ma'am, no disrespect, but that was the cleanest tomonage I've ever been caught with. Like competition level clean. Muscle memory," Margaret said. "Your body doesn't forget even when your mind does." Ricardo was still holding the certificate like it was made of glass. "Mrs. Chen, I owe you an enormous apology. I should never have assumed—" "It's fine," Margaret interrupted gently. "You were trying to keep me safe. I understand, but I didn't listen. None of us did." He looked around at his students, and several of them had the decency to look ashamed. The atmosphere in the gym had completely shifted. What had started as mockery and dismissal had transformed into something else entirely. Curiosity, respect, and, if Margaret was reading the room correctly, a fair amount of embarrassment. Ricardo carefully handed the certificate back to her, treating it like the historical artifact it was. "How long has it been since you've trained?" Margaret folded the document and tucked it back into her bag. "I stopped in 1979 when I left Brazil, so 46 years, give or take. And you just decided to come back, after all that time?" She paused, considering how much to share. These were strangers, after all. But there was something about the moment that felt honest, like it deserved an honest answer. "My husband died 6 months ago," she said quietly. "Heart attack. We were married for 43 years. The room went even quieter, if that was possible. A few people looked down at their feet. "I'm so sorry," Ricardo said, and he meant it. Margaret nodded, acknowledging the condolence. "He always told me I should come back to training. He said I was different when I talked about those days in Rio. More myself. So I thought, why not? I'm 67 years old. How much time do I have left to wait?" Amanda, the young woman with the purple belt, had tears in her eyes. She wiped them quickly, trying to be subtle about it. Tyler, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Chen, I need to apologize. What I said earlier, the way I acted, that was completely out of line. I was a jerk." "You were," Margaret agreed, and a few people laughed nervously. "But you didn't know. None of you did. I walked in here looking like somebody's grandmother because I am somebody's grandmother. 3 grandkids, actually. So I understand the assumption. Still," Tyler insisted, "I should have been respectful regardless. My teacher always says you never know who you're standing across from on the mat. I guess I forgot that lesson." Margaret studied him for a moment. He looked genuinely remorseful, his earlier cockiness completely gone. She'd seen this kind of transformation before. Sometimes the best lessons were the ones that bruised your ego a little. "Apology accepted," she said. "But you should know something. That armbar, I learned it on my 3rd day of training. It's one of the most basic techniques in jiu-jitsu. The fact that it worked on a black belt tells me you dropped your guard because you underestimated your opponent. Don't do that again." Tyler blinked, processing the fact that he'd just been gently schooled by a woman old enough to be his grandmother. Then to his credit, he smiled. "Yes, ma'am. Lesson learned." Ricardo was looking at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. Calculation? Maybe both. "Mrs. Chen, I have a proposition for you. I'm listening. I'd like you to teach. Not the beginners class, the advanced class. These students," he gestured around the room. "They need to learn from someone with your lineage. Someone who learned from the source. Would you consider it? Margaret felt something flutter in her chest. Anxiety, excitement. It had been so long since anyone had asked her to do something that mattered, something beyond caregiving and household management. I don't know if I'm qualified anymore, she said honestly. It's been decades. The game has probably evolved past what I remember. The fundamentals never change, Ricardo countered. And you have something these kids can't get from YouTube videos or seminars. You have direct transmission from Helio Gracie. Do you understand how rare that is? Most of us are 4 or 5 generations removed from the source. You're one. Margaret looked around at the faces staring back at her. They were young, most of them. Hungry to learn. Some still looked skeptical, probably wondering if her victory over Tyler had been a fluke. Others looked genuinely excited. Can I think about it? She asked. Of course. Take all the time you need. Ricardo pulled out his phone. Can I at least get your number? I'd love to sit down and hear more about your training. And honestly, I'd like to document your story if you're comfortable with that. This is living history. They exchanged information and Ricardo called everyone back to the center of the mat. All right, everyone, let's get back to work. And let's all take a moment to remember what we just witnessed. Never ever underestimate someone based on appearance. That's not just a jiu-jitsu lesson. That's a life lesson. The class resumed, but the energy was different now. People kept glancing at Margaret, watching how she moved, trying to spot the technical details they'd missed before. When it was time to rotate partners, several people asked if they could work with her. Margaret ended up rolling with 5 different people that session. With each one, she felt herself remembering more. Her hands found grips without her having to think about them. Her hips moved in ways they hadn't in decades. Her timing was off, sure, and her cardio was terrible, but the foundation was still there. Solid, unshakable. By the end of class, she was exhausted. Her muscles screamed in protest and she knew she'd be sore for days. But she also felt something she hadn't felt in months, maybe years. She felt alive. As people filtered out, several stopped to introduce themselves properly and thank her for the lesson, even though she hadn't technically been teaching. Tyler lingered near the door, clearly wanting to say something but not quite sure how. Margaret walked over to him as she was leaving. You're a good practitioner, she told him. You've got solid technique and good instincts. But you need to work on your humility. The mat has a way of humbling you eventually. Better to learn that lesson now than later. Tyler nodded. Can I ask you something? When you grabbed my arm during that throw, I tried to pull away, but I couldn't. How did you do that? Margaret smiled. Timing and structure. You were already off balance from the throw. I just maintained connection and followed the path of least resistance. Your arm wanted to go where I put it. I just helped it get there. That's insane. That's jiu-jitsu. He laughed, shaking his head. I'm going to be hearing about this for months, maybe years. Good, Margaret said. Let it remind you to be better. She drove home through the darkening streets, her mind racing. The house was dark when she pulled into the driveway. It was always dark now, unless she remembered to leave a light on. David used to complain about her forgetting to turn off lights. Now she'd give anything to hear that complaint again. Inside, she dropped her gym bag by the door and headed straight for the bathroom. Her gi was soaked with sweat, and her body ached in ways that were both familiar and foreign. She caught her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. Her face was flushed, her hair a mess, her eyes bright. She looked happy. The shower was long and hot, steam filling the bathroom until she could barely see. As the water ran over her sore muscles, she let herself think about Ricardo's offer. Teaching. Could she really do that? Did she have anything to offer these young, hungry students who'd been training in the modern era of jiu-jitsu? But then she thought about the look on Tyler's face when she'd caught him in that armbar. The surprise. The realization that he'd underestimated someone and paid the price. That was a valuable lesson, and she'd taught it without saying a word. Maybe she did have something to offer after all. After the shower, Margaret made herself a simple dinner. Rice, vegetables, a piece of fish. She ate at the kitchen table, the same table where she and David had shared thousands of meals. His chair was empty like always, but tonight the emptiness felt different. Less oppressive, more like space for possibility. Her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter, Jennifer. Hey Mom, just checking in. How was your day? Margaret stared at the message for a long moment. How did you sum up a day like this? How did you explain that you'd walked into a jiu-jitsu gym for the first time in 46 years, and submitted a black belt in less than 10 seconds. She typed back, "Interesting. I'll call you tomorrow and tell you about it." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Jennifer was probably trying to figure out what interesting meant. Finally, a response came through. "Can't wait to hear. Love you, Mom." "Love you too." Margaret set the phone down and looked around the kitchen. Photo frames lined the walls. Her wedding day. The kids when they were small. Family vacations. David's retirement party. A whole life documented in still images, but those were memories, and memories. As she was learning weren't enough to live on. She needed something current. Something present. Something that made her feel like she was still moving forward instead of just looking backward. The gym might be that something. That night, Margaret slept better than she had in months. No nightmares about hospitals or funerals. No waking up at 3 in the morning, reaching across the bed for someone who wasn't there. Just deep, dreamless sleep, the kind that came from physical exhaustion and mental peace. She woke up sore, as predicted. Her shoulders, her hips, her knees, everything hurt. But it was a good hurt. An earned hurt. The kind that came from using your body the way it was meant to be used. Over the next few days, Margaret's phone lit up with messages. Ricardo had apparently told everyone he knew about the elderly woman with a Helio Gracie lineage who'd walked into his gym. Word spread fast in the Jiu-Jitsu community. People wanted interviews. Local martial arts blogs wanted to write articles. Someone even mentioned a documentary. It was overwhelming, but also oddly validating. For so long, that part of her life had been this small private thing. A story she'd tell at dinner parties sometimes, usually met with polite interest, but nothing more. Now suddenly people cared. They wanted to know everything. What was Helio like? What was training like in the 70s? How different was the art back then? Margaret found herself remembering details she thought she'd forgotten. The way Helio would demonstrate a technique once perfectly, and then expect you to replicate it. The way he talked about efficiency and leverage, how he'd designed the art specifically for smaller, weaker people to defend themselves against larger, stronger opponents. The philosophy behind the movements, not just the movements themselves. It had been about more than fighting. It had been about understanding your body, your opponent, and the space between you, about remaining calm under pressure, about accepting that you would lose sometimes, and that losing was just another form of learning. These were lessons she'd carried with her through nursing school, through raising kids, through all the challenges life had thrown at her. She'd just never connected them back to jiu-jitsu before. A week after her first class, Margaret returned to the academy. This time, when she walked through the door, the response was completely different. People greeted her by name. They asked how she was feeling. Tyler, who was already warming up, waved and called out, "Mrs. Chen, you came back." "I did," she confirmed, setting her bag down. Ricardo appeared from his office, grinning. "I'm so glad you're here. I've been getting calls all week about you. Apparently word has spread, so I've noticed. Have you thought about my offer? About teaching?" Margaret had thought about little else if she was being honest. "I have some conditions. Name them. I'm not interested in teaching beginner basics. You have good instructors for that. But I'd like to work with your advanced students on some of the older techniques, the stuff that's maybe been forgotten as the sport has evolved. Would that work?" Ricardo's grin got wider. "That would be perfect." And just like that, Margaret Chen became a teacher again. Margaret's first official teaching session was scheduled for the following Tuesday. She spent the weekend preparing, digging through old notebooks she'd kept from her training days in Rio. The pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with sketches and notes in both English and Portuguese. Technique breakdowns, philosophical observations, little reminders to herself about timing and leverage. She'd been meticulous back then, writing down everything Helio taught. At the time, she'd thought it was just good study habits. Now looking back, she realized she'd been preserving something important. These notebooks were a snapshot of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in its earlier form, before it had been codified and systematized and spread across the world. On Tuesday evening, Margaret arrived at the academy 30 minutes early. Ricardo was already there, setting up mats and adjusting the lighting. "Nervous?" he asked. "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "I haven't taught anything in decades." "What if I'm terrible at it?" Ricardo laughed. "I've been teaching for 15 years and I'm still nervous before every class." "It means you care. That's a good thing. Students started arriving, and Margaret noticed the group was different from the first class she'd attended. These were the serious practitioners. Multiple black belts, brown belts who looked like they could compete professionally, purple belts who moved with the kind of confidence that came from hundreds of hours on the mat. Tyler was there, of course. But his whole demeanor had changed. He helped set up equipment, greeted Margaret respectfully, and generally seemed like a different person than the cocky guy who'd mocked her 2 weeks ago. Getting submitted had apparently been good for his character. Amanda was there too, along with the older brown belt who'd watched Margaret's first class so thoughtfully. His name was Robert, and he'd been training for 20 years. When Ricardo introduced them properly, Robert shook Margaret's hand with genuine reverence. "I've been training my whole adult life," he said, "and I've never met anyone with direct lineage to Helio. This is an honor." "The honor is mine," Margaret replied. "I'm learning just as much from all of you as you'll learn from me." Once everyone had arrived, about 15 people in total, Ricardo called them to the center of the mat. "As you all know, we have a very special guest instructor tonight. Mrs. Margaret Chen trained under Helio Gracie himself in Rio de Janeiro in the late 70s. She's going to share some of the original techniques and philosophies that she learned directly from the source. I want everyone to listen, practice with intention, and most importantly, show respect. Mrs. Chen, the mat is yours." Margaret stepped forward, feeling the weight of 15 pairs of eyes on her. For a moment, she was 19 again, the only woman in a gym full of Brazilian men who didn't speak her language. The fear was the same, but back then she'd pushed through it. She could push through it now. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "I want to start by saying that I'm not here to tell you that the old ways are better than the new ways. Jiu-Jitsu has evolved tremendously since I learned it, and that evolution has made it more effective, more accessible, more sophisticated. What I'm offering is perspective, a look at the foundations that everything else is built on." She paused, making eye contact with several students. When Helio Gracie designed Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, he wasn't thinking about sport competition. He was thinking about survival. He was a small man with health problems, and he needed to be able to defend himself against larger, stronger opponents. So everything he taught was filtered through that lens. Efficiency, leverage, conservation of energy. These aren't just techniques. They're principles that apply to life itself. Amanda raised her hand. "What was he like? As a person?" Margaret smiled. "He was intense. He expected excellence, but he was also incredibly patient. He understood that learning takes time. I remember once I was getting frustrated because I couldn't get a sweep to work. I kept trying to muscle through it. Helio stopped the class, called me to the center of the mat, and demonstrated the technique again. But this time he did it in slow motion. So slow you could see every weight shift, every grip adjustment, every tiny detail. And he said something I've never forgotten. Força é para quem não sabe. Strength is for people who don't know." She could see several people nodding, committing the phrase to memory. "Today I want to teach you a technique that's fallen out of favor in modern competition, but is incredibly effective in self-defense scenarios. It's called the closed guard telephone choke. Has anyone seen this before?" A few people shook their heads. Tyler raised his hand tentatively. "I've heard of it, but I've never learned it properly." "Good. Then we'll start from the beginning." Margaret gestured for Ricardo to help demonstrate. He stepped forward and dropped into her closed guard, wrapping his legs around her waist. "The setup begins when your opponent has their hands on your collar," Margaret explained, allowing Ricardo to grip. Most modern players would immediately start working guard breaks or submission setups, but sometimes, especially against a larger opponent, the direct path isn't the best path. This choke works by using their own grips against them. She walked through the technique slowly, explaining each step: how to control the opponent's sleeve, how to thread your hand behind their neck, how to use your legs to break their posture, how to finish with a cross-collar grip that felt gentle but was devastatingly effective. "The key is patience," she emphasized. "This isn't a technique you force. You wait for the right moment, and when it comes, you act decisively. Let's practice." The class paired off, and Margaret circulated, making adjustments. She was surprised by how natural it felt. Teaching was just another form of communication, and she'd spent 35 years as a nurse, which meant she'd spent 35 years explaining complex things to anxious people. The skills transferred. When she got to Tyler, he was struggling with the grip adjustment. I can't get my hand deep enough, he said, frustrated. Margaret knelt down beside him. You're trying to force it. Watch. She demonstrated on his partner, moving slowly so he could see. The space opens when you extend their arm. You're not making the space, you're finding the space that's already there. Try again. Tyler tried again, and this time it worked. His partner tapped, and Tyler's face, he lit up with the kind of pure joy that only comes from finally understanding something you've been struggling with. That's it, Margaret said. You've got it. An hour into the session, Margaret called for a water break. People gathered around, asking questions, sharing observations. The atmosphere was electric with the kind of energy that comes from genuine learning. Robert approached with his notebook. Would you mind if I wrote down some of the details you've shared? The philosophy stuff, especially. Of course not. I have my old notebooks from training if you'd ever like to look at them. His eyes went wide. Are you serious? That would be incredible. I'll bring them next time. As the class resumed, Margaret taught 2 more techniques. An armbar from mount that used a slightly different angle than the modern version, and a sweep from half guard that relied on timing rather than athleticism. With each technique, she emphasized the principles behind the movements. Why they worked, when to use them, how to adapt them to different body types and situations. By the end of the 2-hour session, everyone was exhausted but energized. Ricardo called them back to the center of the mat for the traditional bow out. Before we finish, he said, I want to thank Mrs. Chen for sharing her knowledge with us. What we learned tonight isn't just technique, it's history, it's philosophy, it's a connection to the roots of our art. I hope everyone recognizes how special this is. The class applauded, and Margaret felt her eyes getting misty. She blinked the tears back. This wasn't the time for emotion, but still it was overwhelming. To be valued for this thing she'd loved so much, this thing she'd thought was lost forever. It meant more than she could articulate. After class, as people were filtering out, Tyler approached her again. Mrs. Chen, can I talk to you for a minute? Of course. He looked uncomfortable, like he was trying to find the right words. I wanted to apologize again. Not just for what I said that first night, but for my whole attitude. I've been training for 10 years and I thought I knew everything. But watching you teach tonight, I realized how much I don't know. Not just about technique, but about the art itself. The purpose behind it. Margaret put her hand on his shoulder. You're still young. You have time to learn. And the fact that you're open to learning, that you can admit you don't know everything, that's actually a sign of wisdom. I was thinking, Tyler continued, if you're willing, I'd like to train with you regularly. Like private lessons or something. I know you're probably busy, but I feel like I have a lot to learn from you. Margaret considered it. She'd been so focused on just surviving each day that she hadn't thought about what came next. But here was an opportunity, not just to teach, but to really pass something on, to create a direct lineage of knowledge from Helio to her to this young man, who was finally ready to listen. I think that could be arranged, she said. Let me talk to Ricardo about scheduling. Tyler's face broke into a huge grin. Thank you. Seriously, thank you. As Margaret drove home that night, she felt different, lighter, like something heavy had been lifted from her shoulders. She'd spent 6 months carrying grief around like a backpack full of stones, and while the grief was still there, probably always would be, it wasn't the only thing anymore. She had purpose again. She had something to look forward to. She had a reason to get up in the morning beyond just going through the motions. When she got home, she called Jennifer. Hey, Mom.
I've been waiting for you to call.
What was so interesting about your day last week? Margaret laughed. How much time do you have? She told Jennifer everything. About finding the GI in the closet. About registering for the advanced class. About Tyler's mockery and the 10-second submission and the teaching opportunity. She talked for almost an hour, the words pouring out like water from a broken dam. Jennifer listened to the whole thing, occasionally interjecting with questions or exclamations of surprise. When Margaret finally finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mom, Jennifer said quietly, you sound happy. It was such a simple observation, but it hit Margaret like a punch. When was the last time someone had said that to her? When was the last time it had been true? I think I am, Margaret said, surprised by her own answer. Or at least I'm starting to be. Good, that's really good. Dad would be so proud of you. The mention of David made Margaret's throat tighten, but it wasn't the sharp pain it had been before. It was softer, more bittersweet than bitter. He always said I should go back to it, Margaret said. He was right. He usually was. They talked for a while longer, catching up on Jennifer's life, the grandkids, mundane family things that felt comforting in their normalcy. When they finally hung up, Margaret sat in the quiet house, but the silence didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt peaceful. Over the next few weeks, Margaret fell into a routine. She taught at the academy twice a week, worked with Tyler and a few other students for private lessons, and trained herself during the open mat sessions. Her body was adapting, getting stronger, more flexible. The soreness became less severe. Her timing improved. Her cardio, while still not great, was better than it had been.